My name is Gordon Hanson. I'm an economist at UC San Diego, and I actually study international trade. So I think, like many of you today, you found your way into the interest in satellite imagery, remote sensing from some other disciplinary interest. You have questions you want to ask, and satellite imagery suddenly offers you an opportunity to ask those questions in a way that was very difficult to do before. So what I'd like to do in my 15 minutes is two things. One is to give you a sense of how did economists get to the point that they're using satellite imagery, and what do we anticipate that the incorporation of this data will have on how we do our analysis, and then to give you an example of how we're actually doing this in practice. So economists have been interested in the spatial organization of economic activity for a long time. You will go all the way back to the work of Alfred Marshall, who kind of wrote the first decent economic textbook 100-odd years ago. And he wandered around the Lancashire cotton textile industry, and he noticed that economic activity was highly spatially agglomerated. And he said, this is more than about having access to coal or access to waterways. It's about connections between people when they try and produce stuff that affects their productivity. And so he put a set of ideas on the table about what it is that motivates economic production to happen in spatially compact areas. And those Marshallian externalities were something that guided economic research for the next 80-odd years or so. So one of his ideas was that when you put people near each other, they learn from each other, their knowledge spillovers, and that raises their productivity. Another idea was that when one firm locates near another firm, it gives workers an incentive to acquire the skills that are useful to that particular industry. So it improves the process through which workers acquire the skills that are valued in very specific types of production. And third, by the kind of a similar logic, when firms start locating near each other, input suppliers are going to show up. Firms that want to sell parts and components or raw materials to those downstream producers. And so that thinking ultimately led, kind of decades later, economists to produce the first models of how systems of cities work. And the landmark work here was now 40-odd years ago by Vernon Henderson in a paper in 1974. And Henderson didn't try and provide a micro-foundations of these Marshallian externalities. He just said, I'm going to write down a mathematical formula that assume that there are these forces that give an incentive for localization to occur, and see what that implies about what the spatial distribution of economic activity will look like. And well, what it means, not surprisingly, is that you're going to get areas where stuff happens, cities, and where you're going to get areas where not that much stuff happens. And so out of this, economists began to develop a model that would help explain Zipf's law. So what Zipf's law tells you is that there's a power law to describe the size distribution of cities. There's a handful of cities way out in the right tail that are really big, and there's a mass of cities that are really small. So the next group of economists came along and said, well, what Henderson did was all fine and well, but he just kind of assumed that these agglomerative forces exist. Let's try and endogenously derive their existence through the individual choices of economic actors. And that was what Paul Krugman did in his Nobel Prize winning work. And so Krugman developed a model of economic geography whereby one firm just wanting to have access to markets would then attract other firms, and that would create a self-organizing process through which cities would come about. So that got us to kind of models that were kind of vaguely, that were formal, but they weren't all that realistic. Krugman's model of cities had two regions. Okay, so you want to take that to the data and think about understanding the impact of India's Golden Quadrilateral project, which we'll talk, that's going to be a specific example we're going to talk about. I don't know how you do that with two regions. So the third generation of research came along, which tried to add granularity to the economic environment. was to think about real variation in the spatial distribution of fixed features like waterways, like natural ports, like good farmland. And also acknowledge the fact that you have lots of heterogeneity in the types of firms that are going to exist, and those firms are going to, the big, highly productive firms are going to find their way into cities. Google will occupy the high-value places in Silicon Valley, and the less productive firms are going to get kind of shunted off into the hinterland. So that sort of work gave rise to models like Dave Donaldson produced in his Clark Medal winning work on railroads of the Raj, understanding how the creation of railroads inspires a process of economic development, but in a very spatially uneven way, concentrating development in some places and leaving other areas as barren as they were before. Ben Faber, who's here at UC Berkeley, has extended that analysis, thinking about what the impact of the construction of China's highway system has had. And so that's where we are today. We've added realism, we've added granularity. We're still, however, working at a geographic level, which is the equivalent of a county or a district. And what satellite imagery allows us to do is to work at a much, much smaller, in much higher spatial detail. And so now, what the promise of satellite imagery offers is the ability to measure these outcomes we've been studying at a decadal frequency at the county level, now in something that is very high in its spatial dimension and very high in its temporal dimension too. So what this means is that Solomon talked about the value of having access to this hard-to-collect survey data to understand networks. What satellite imagery potentially allows us to do is to measure outcomes at extremely low cost, which helps economists do what economists like to do, which is to estimate treatment effects. So now when we want to understand the railroads or highway systems, we can think about their impacts on a neighborhood level or even at a household level. But there are some perils that come along with this process. One of the things we're learning is that turning images into useful economic magnitudes is tough. And before I go on to the example, I want to highlight three challenges that we face. First, when most of the survey data that we have access to tell us about flows. They tell us about the hours of work you provide a day. They tell us about the income that you earn. They tell us about the spending that a household generates. All of those are flow values. They're things that happen today that may or may not happen tomorrow. Now, Nightlights give us a flow measure of economic activity, but daytime satellite imagery aren't about flows. They're about stocks. Does a house sit here or does a house not here? Is there a tree there? Is there not a tree there? Are there cars parked in this parking lot, or are there not cars parked in this parking lot? And so what this means is that we think about understanding economic impacts, we're likely to shift to thinking about the impacts of interventions like highways and railroads on wealth, which are related to stocks, rather than on incomes, which are related to flows. And so this requires lots of subtle changes in thinking about the complementary satellite imagery that we want to collect, and then also the economic modeling, which tends to ignore the wealth part and focus much more on stuff like income. A second challenge is that the process of converting pictures of things into an economic summary measure, something that has a value associated with it, is going to be a process that is highly heterogeneous. So think about identifying a palapa, okay? So if you identify a palapa in rural Mexico, that probably is an indicator of it being a lower income area. And so if I were to correlate structures with economic values, I would associate a negative value with a palapa. Now think about where I live in San Diego and go out to Rancho Santa Fe. If you have a palapa in your backyard, that probably indicates high income. That means you have a pool house, you had a custom-built palapa next to your 4,000 square foot jacuzzi with a water slide and a tennis court. So now the hedonic price attached to a palapa is positive rather than negative. So training the data, training our classifiers so that we turn images into economic values requires, I know that Joe said that didn't like the use of ground truth. That ground truth is going to be really important. We've got to have prices at high spatial resolution for this to be useful for us. So let me give you just a really quick example of how we're trying to do this in one particular context, which is understanding the impact of construction of transportation infrastructure in India. And what we're trying to do is go beyond nightlights, which have been really valuable. And what we've learned is that nightlights are a really good summary statistic for GDP. And that works at the national level, it works at the state level, it works at the city level. But once you get below the city level, you could start to get down to neighborhoods, it gets more complicated if the neighborhoods are in bigger urban areas. And that's because of the spinal tap problem, okay? Measures of nightlights go to 63, okay? Not 11, 63. You can't turn them up to 64. And so what you have is right censoring, which means that your ability to identify change in areas that are already highly agglomerated is limited. You also have blooming effects once you start looking at neighborhoods where bright areas are going to spill over and affect less bright areas. So here's a picture of one segment of the Golden Quadrilateral project, which extends from Delhi to Kolkata. And what you can see in the red areas are areas that we've identified as built up. So let's look at kind of alternative versions of classification of urbanization. Here's one that Ron Goldblatt and I, along with Amit Khandelwal and a variety of different co-authors in different projects, have been developing in the context of India, also in Mexico, in the United States, where we use imagery from Landsat plus ground truth data on hand-classified indicators of whether a pixel has urban structures on it or not to identify the process of urbanization. And so we can go, and so here's a characterization of what's built up and what's not at a pixel level, 30 meter, at a 30 meter resolution in 4 Indian cities. Now let's contrast this with what nightlights would tell us. What nightlights would tell us is that you're going to have this big blob that hits 63 that covers most of your urban area. And it's not going to recognize that inside that blob there's lots of variation. So if we want to think about the impacts of something like building transportation infrastructure, and we work with the Golden Quadrilateral project, what we're going to see is that already in 2000, before the project was ever built, we've got lots of areas around cities that are already at the maximum value. Right censoring is already a problem. Now, if we wanted to study urbanization, the impact of the highway construction outside of those city areas, getting into more rural areas, nightlights aren't going to be so bad. But if you want to think about studying urbanization inspired by the building of transportation infrastructure in and around the urban core, there's going to be limitations there. So what do we do? So it's not to say that nightlights aren't useful, but nightlights in and of themselves are subject to a series of data problems, which means that they're going to give us an incomplete sense of the impact of building transportation infrastructure on the distribution of economic activity. So what we can then do is we can use our alternative measures of urbanization that are based on daytime satellite imagery with a resolution at 30 meters. And now what we can do is we can exploit that within urban area variation, recognizing that inside Delhi, even today, you have lots of areas at a 30-meter resolution where urbanization hasn't happened or urbanization is far less developed. And so what we're doing in this project is we're trying to understand how the construction, how big events, lumpy investments, like building highways, like building railroads, equivalently, you could think of it the construction of major manufacturing plants, electricity generating facilities, things that have to go someplace and not someplace else, affect the spatial distribution of economic activity, and how do our answers to those questions vary when we use high resolution versus lower resolution data. Thank you.